Before we start, if you're enjoying these conversations, please make sure that you like or subscribe to Cleaning Up. It really helps other people to find us. Cleaning Up is brought to you by the Liebreich Foundation and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich and this is Cleaning Up. Welcome to the second instalment of the two-part audio version of my recent BloombergNEF blog entitled Separating Hype from Hydrogen. This is the part where things might get controversial. If your view of the future is all hydrogen all the time in all applications, be prepared to be annoyed. In part 1, we looked at hydrogen supply and distribution and zoomed in on the EU's $550 billion hydrogen strategy, which sits at the heart of its Green Deal and COVID recovery plan. In broad summary, the episode concluded that green hydrogen, that's hydrogen produced via electrolysis using renewable energy, will be cost competitive with blue hydrogen, that's zero carbon hydrogen produced via fossil fuels with carbon capture, in around a decade. It will be competitive with grey hydrogen, that's hydrogen produced from fossil fuels without carbon capture, the way almost all of it is produced today, by around 2050. It was also clear that around the world, governments are going to be pouring lots of money into producing clean hydrogen in coming decades. And by lots, we're talking not billions of dollars, but trillions of dollars. So, in a few years, there's going to be a lot of clean hydrogen. In part 2 today, I'm going to look at the demand side. Where on earth is all that clean hydrogen supposed to go? Or, to put it another way, what if the world throws a hydrogen party and no one shows up? We know that, in theory, green hydrogen could be used throughout industry, transport, power, and heating. However, it won't magically take over in sectors that don't currently use hydrogen just because it's green. If it wants to penetrate into new parts of the economy, hydrogen is going to have to fight its way in, use case by use case, and it won't be easy. Not only does it have to beat the incumbent technology, it also has to beat every other zero-carbon option for that use case, and this is where hydrogen hype really meets reality. As a chemical feedstock, of course, hydrogen is irreplaceable. However, as an energy storage medium, it has only a 50% round-trip efficiency, far worse than batteries. As a source of work, fuel cells, turbines and engines are only 60% efficient at best, far worse than electric motors and far more complex. As a source of heat, even cheap, dirty hydrogen costs 4 times as much as natural gas. As a way of transporting energy, hydrogen distribution networks cost 3 times as much as power lines, and ships and trucks are even worse. What this means is that hydrogen's role in the final energy mix of a future net zero emissions world will be to do things that cannot be done more simply, more cheaply, and more efficiently by the direct use of clean electricity and batteries. To paraphrase the famous Heineken slogan of the 1970s and 80s, which some listeners may be familiar with, hydrogen decarbonizes parts of the energy system electricity cannot reach. Fans of hydrogen like to describe it as the Swiss Army knife of energy, because in theory it can do anything. Their analogy, however, is truer than they think. In practice, your Swiss Army knife sits in your drawer waiting for a camping trip because there are almost always better tools for the job. That's why I propose my hydrogen ladder as a more useful analogy. At the top are use cases where we absolutely have to switch to clean hydrogen because we're currently using grey or polluting, dirty hydrogen. Down at the bottom, however, are use cases where hydrogen, although it works, technically, is far more complicated, inefficient, or unsafe than other simpler and cheaper solutions. Please be clear, however, None of this means that I'm against hydrogen or that hydrogen's future role will be marginal. Far from it. First of all, the little phrase I used earlier, as a chemical feedstock, will be doing an awful lot of work. Secondly, hydrogen's limited use in meeting final energy demand has an inevitable corollary. We're going to become even more dependent on electricity than we are now. An electricity system built on a foundation of base cost, very cheap wind and solar power may be affordable, but it's going to need two things that hydrogen is uniquely positioned to supply: unlimited flexible capacity for reliable backup and strategic energy storage for resilience to shocks. So, the hydrogen economy is dead. Long live the hydrogen economy. Let's dive in now and see if we can figure out in which use cases hydrogen is likely to win and where it is almost certain to lose. We're talking medium to long term here. Of course, if you throw enough subsidies at something, you can usually make it stick. For a time. My assumption is that in the end, economics, thermodynamics, geopolitics, and plain old human behaviour will win through. So let's begin with a tour of the hard to decarbonise sectors, which I first looked at in my piece for BloombergNEF in March 2018, entitled Beyond 3/3, The Road to Deep Decarbonisation. We'll start with industry, which accounts for around 24% of CO2 emissions globally. The EU hydrogen strategy particularly highlights the use of green hydrogen to, quote, reduce and replace the use of carbon-intensive hydrogen in refineries, the production of ammonia, and for new forms of methanol production. Production of grey hydrogen for these sectors currently accounts for 6% of EU natural gas demand and 2% of its coal demand. If green hydrogen can be produced at a price competitive with grey, as targeted by the European Hydrogen Strategy, it should be straightforward for it to take over these existing markets, reducing the EU's CO2 emissions by 2.2%. There is simply no way for electricity to act as a substitute. At present, hydrogen is a relatively minor feedstock to the chemicals industry, but that could be about to change. Globally, chemicals account for 14% of crude oil, 8% of natural gas, and 2% of coal use. As the bulk use of oil, gas, and coal as fuels declines, the cost of extracting and refining them to produce chemicals will inevitably increase, as will the cost of offsetting their emissions. Assembling chemicals from zero-emissions hydrogen and captured carbon will, as a result, become increasingly competitive. We should expect to see ever more complex molecules being made this way in ever larger volumes, driving a rapidly increasing market for clean hydrogen. A strong start. Next up, steel. Steel is almost as straightforward as chemical feedstocks, but not quite. The steel industry is, along with cement, the largest industrial emitter of CO2. In Europe, it's responsible for 20% of industrial and 8% of total emissions. Setting aside the 28% of output from recycled steel, the most common way of processing raw iron ore is via the humble blast furnace, using coke produced from metallurgical coal. For net zero steel, you have to either eliminate the use of coking coal or capture the resulting CO2 emissions. In August last year, Swedish steelmaker SSAB, together with state-owned utility Vattenfall and mining company LKAB, started test operations at the HYBRIT pilot plant for fossil-free steel in Luleå, Sweden. SSAB is aiming for the first commercially competitive fossil-free steel in 2026 and to make its entire operations fossil-free by 2045. In its 2019 analysis of the cost of making fossil-free steel, BloombergNEF concluded that hydrogen-based steel would become competitive with the most expensive current steel production as soon as it could be made for 2.5 euros per kilo, which is any time around now. Outcompeting the cheapest steel production in the world, however, would require a hydrogen price of 0.6 euros per kilo, which is unlikely even in 2050. A more likely green hydrogen price of $2 per kilo by 2030 would require a carbon price of $125 per metric ton, dropping perhaps to $50 per ton by 2050 as hydrogen prices continue to fall. So hydrogen looks like a strong hope for zero-carbon steel as long as there's a robust carbon price. It may not, however, have things all its own way. Another contender is direct reduction using electricity. Startup Boston Metal, which counts oil major-backed OGCI and Bill Gates-founded Breakthrough Energy Ventures among its investors, is developing a molten oxide electrolysis system that could be used for the production of multiple metals, as well as rare earths, starting with steel and aiming at a price point even below blast furnaces. So, while steel is a likely use case for clean hydrogen, direct use of electricity might just beat it to the punch, so it doesn't quite make it to the top of the ladder. Next, let's look at sectors whose emissions result mainly from their demand for heat. We can use glass as an example. In Europe, glass manufacturing accounts for 3.1% of industrial CO2 emissions. Float glass plants are wonders of modern engineering. 300 metres long, with temperatures hot enough to melt sand and recycled cullet at one end, and a river of perfectly flat glass emerging at the other. Major maintenance intervals, when the plant is allowed to go cold, are measured not in years, but in decades. It may seem obvious that the solution is to swap the use of natural gas with hydrogen, but it won't be easy. As we've heard, the EU hydrogen strategy targets a clean hydrogen price of 1.1 to 2.4 euros by 2030, which translates into an equivalent cost for natural gas of $11 to $21 per million BTU. But natural gas in Europe, before the recent extraordinary price surge, cost just $4 per million BTU. The European glass industry is covered by the EU ETS. Assuming hydrogen can reach the low end of the EU's 2030 target, competing with natural gas at $4 per million BTU would still require an EU ETS price of 120 euros or $140 per metric ton of CO2, around 3 times today's price. And if you want to get started using green hydrogen in the European glass industry right now, with the cheapest currently available hydrogen at 2.5 euros per kilo, you would need an EU ETS price or other support mechanism worth no less than 350 euros per tonne. Looking outside Europe to places where there are no carbon prices or subsidies, if you assume that after the current unusual price behaviour, natural gas is again available at between $2 and $5 per million BTU in many parts of the world, green hydrogen would need to reach a price of 25 to 60 cents per kilo. It will be a long wait. The biggest problem for hydrogen as a provider of industrial heat is not even that it requires a high carbon price to push out natural gas, but that it requires a higher carbon price than that required for clean electricity to do the same job. According to BloombergNEF's August 2019 Economics of Hydrogen Production from Renewables, by 2050, green hydrogen may achieve a price of 80 cents per kilo, but that would require directly connected renewable power being available at $14 to $17 per megawatt hour. To compete with cheap natural gas in the heat market, at those prices, green electricity would only need a $56 per tonne CO2 price. But the green hydrogen that it could produce at $0.880 per kilo would still require a price of $94 per tonne to be competitive. So using the electricity directly is simply going to be cheaper. It makes sense if you think about it. Why turn electricity into hydrogen, incurring energetic losses, just to burn the hydrogen? In Europe, where natural gas, before the current price spike, was selling for $4 per million BTU, renewable electricity at $17 per megawatt hour would not need a carbon price at all, but the green hydrogen it could produce would still need a carbon price of $57 per tonne. It's not looking good for hydrogen in industrial heat. It's sliding down the rungs of the ladder. But in fact, that's not even the whole picture. Electricity can be used to power a heat pump, delivering multiple times its own energy content. Heat pumps are usually associated with low temperature heat, up to around 60 degrees Celsius. But there has been a quiet revolution over the past decade. Industrial heat pumps already work for temperatures up to 160 degrees Celsius, with a coefficient of performance of around 3, which translates into energy savings of 66%. Add in losses from electrolysis, compression and transport of hydrogen, and you could see an 80% energy saving by using a heat pump instead of hydrogen for industrial heat up to the temperatures of around 160 degrees. In fact, research currently underway could push the temperature range of industrial heat pumps as high as 280 degrees Celsius and beyond. This would allow heat pumps to serve well over a third of industrial heat demand, everything required in paper pulp, food processing and tobacco, plus preheating for high temperature processes like glass manufacturing, cement or chemicals. And what about those high temperature industrial heat users? It has been claimed loudly and repeatedly on Twitter at least that only gas can heat processes to higher temperatures. A strong candidate for the most important academic paper of 2020 was published in Environmental Research Letters. Silvia Madeddu of the Potsdam Institute and her co-authors looked at 11 industry sectors, making up 92% of Europe's industrial CO2 emissions. The answer: some 78% of heat demand could be met electrically using technologies already in existence. The figure increases to 99% if you include technologies under development. It turns out that there are plenty of ways of getting temperatures of thousands of degrees using electricity directly. Even the cement industry, responsible for 8% of global CO2 emissions, could meet its need for heat directly using renewable electricity. Some 68% of cement's footprint consists of emissions inherent in its chemistry, which have to be captured and stored unless an entirely different chemistry can be used. But the remaining 32%, which relate to heat, could potentially be eliminated through electrification with clean power, perhaps via a thermal plasma process with far higher efficiency than via hydrogen. There are two further reasons why electricity and not hydrogen should be the economically preferred source for industrial heat. The first is that last mile distribution of electricity is much cheaper and safer than last mile distribution of hydrogen. The second arises from a fascinating footnote to Madeddu's work. Fully 1/3 of industry's energy use is wasted between final energy, such as the energy input into a boiler, and what's known as useful energy, in other words, the energy output from that boiler. In just the same way that an induction hob is twice as good at transferring energy into your cooking, not to mention better for domestic air quality, electrical industrial heating can simply be more efficiently targeted and managed than combustion. There may, of course, be local reasons why hydrogen beats green electricity in any given industrial setting. In particular, many industries, including non-ferrous metals, ceramics, chemicals and food, use batch processors, which require large amounts of energy in short bursts. These can cause voltage or frequency problems, necessitating upgrading of the power grid. Battery costs are falling, but storing sufficient electrical power locally to meet these huge bursts of demand may prove prohibitively expensive. Hydrogen could have the advantage here, since it can be delivered by pipeline at very high rates or stored on site in compressed gas or liquid form. However, it's by no means a slam dunk even in those cases. By their nature, batch processors can also be used to help balance the grid. What we're going to see, therefore, is a fight, plant by plant, between the value of demand response and the efficiency difference between direct use of green electricity and green hydrogen on the one hand, and the extra investment required in the distribution grid on the other. It's a fight that green electricity will generally win. It is cheaper per unit of heat, cheaper to deliver, and better at enabling end-use efficiency. So hydrogen in industrial heat doesn't slide all the way to the bottom of the ladder, but it's not far off. There's one fascinating implication of all this. Imagine the potential prize for countries or companies that don't waste resources on hydrogen for industrial heat, but focus instead on developing electrical solutions for different processes and sectors. Next, let's turn to water and space heating, which together account for around 6% of global emissions. We've already covered the basic economics, and for hydrogen, they're unforgiving. Because of efficiency losses between renewable power and green hydrogen, if electricity can be used as a heat source, it should be. Even if green hydrogen were available at BloombergNEF's lowest 2050 price of 80 cents per kilo, it would still need a carbon price of €47, $57 per tonne to compete with European gas at $4 per million BTU and $94 per tonne to compete with gas at $2 per million BTU. So much for wholesale customers. Of course, where green hydrogen and electricity generally compete in space heating is at the user location in commercial and residential property. You need to take into consideration retail markup, then sales tax, which currently and incredibly foolishly given the climate crisis favours natural gas in many countries, as well as capital cost and operating cost. But clean electricity still beats clean hydrogen. Heat pumps are the killer app. Basic thermodynamics means that they produce up to 4 times more heat than could be delivered via a hydrogen boiler or furnace for each unit of wind or solar power that you generate. Basic thermodynamics also says that the heat pump efficiency falls as the outside temperatures fall, just when you need heat the most. But modern heat pumps, contrary to a lot of the rumours out there, continue to work down to minus 22 degrees centigrade, which most parts of the world never reach. Hot water can be stored before a cold snap much more cheaply than storing hydrogen or electricity, and thermal batteries are seeing rapid innovation. Where there is a risk of very low temperatures, hybrid heat pumps may be the solution, switching some proportion of demand back to gas for just a few very cold days to spare the grid. But low-temperature shared-loop heat circuits and ground-source heat pumps look even more elegant. Capital cost for heat pumps is a real concern. Switching hundreds of millions of homes and offices worldwide at a global cost of trillions of dollars is not something that can happen overnight. Ramping up the provision of biogas will reduce the scale of the problem. Increasing combined heat and power or CHP capacity will also help. blending some hydrogen into the natural gas system might buy some time, though remember that blending 20% hydrogen by volume reduces CO2 use by just 6%, because hydrogen has such low volumetric density. Sooner or later, however, we're going to have to switch every building either to clean electric heat pumps, biogas, or pure green hydrogen. At least 4 times more efficient, using a fraction of the land footprint to generate their power supply, heat pumps should win. And of course, they can also be reversed in summer to act as air conditioners, unlike hydrogen boilers, furnaces, or fuel cells. Great for those climate change-driven heat waves. Clean hydrogen for heating, therefore, is pretty near to the bottom of the ladder of use cases. Okay, now it's time to deal with the big one, transportation. This is the one where discussion has generated, and indeed continues to generate, the most amount of heat for the least amount of light, where physics, engineering, economics, and behavioural science are routinely cast aside in favour of magical thinking. The late Frank Zappa once said that stupidity, rather than hydrogen, was the most common element on the planet. What he didn't say is that in the minds of some car buffs, the two combine to create the alloy hopium, which has the extraordinary ability to absorb public and private money. In 2003, the EU-backed European Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technology Platform forecast up to 5 million hydrogen cars on the streets by 2020, replacing 5% of transport fuel with hydrogen. Japan targeted 5 million fuel cell vehicles by 2020. George W. Bush said that fuel cell cars would be competitive with internal combustion ones by 2010 and would eliminate over 11 million barrels per day of US oil demand by 2040. Back in the real world, there are today fewer than 20,000 heavily subsidised hydrogen fuel cell vehicles on the road globally, served by just 400 almost exclusively publicly funded hydrogen filling stations. Until this year, there were 3 commercial hydrogen fuel cell car models on the market: the Toyota Mirai, the Hyundai Nexo, and the Honda Clarity. There are now just 2. In a moment of real clarity, Honda conceded defeat. The fuel cell vehicles have no more range than comparable-sized battery electric vehicles. They are no lighter. They have less luggage space because they are full of pressurized hydrogen tanks. They have half the acceleration and a lower top speed. And they have more moving parts, meaning higher maintenance costs. If none of that has dissuaded you from buying one, there's the price, up to 20% higher than the equivalent battery electric vehicle. But if you want a funny-looking 2-seater for the same monthly lease cost as a Tesla 3 or a Volkswagen ID3, there's always the River Simple Rasa, if it ever gets built. When it comes to refueling, supposedly the reason why hydrogen should beat EVs, the fact is that most current EV drivers charge at or very near home, at work, or at the mall, eliminating regular trips to the gas station. On the odd longer trip, rapid chargers can add 200 miles of range, about as far as most people want to drive between bathroom breaks, in 20 minutes. Concerns about lack of on-street and motorway charging are like turn-of-the-millennium concerns about internet bandwidth. Would video on demand ever work? The short answer, yes. In time, charging will be as ubiquitous as internet bandwidth. By now, most car makers have abandoned their hydrogen car programs, including Mercedes-Benz, Ford, and General Motors. VW has come down very firmly on the side of battery electric vehicles, though it keeps a token fuel cell program going, with one Audi SUV perhaps in the pipeline for 2023. BMW and Jaguar Land Rover may still be talking hydrogen cars, but they're launching electric ones. Even Japanese EV laggards, Honda and Toyota, for decades the standard bearers for hydrogen cars, have done a handbrake turn and are now fast-tracking the launch of dozens of plug-in hybrid and pure electric cars so they don't get left behind. From a public policy perspective, the real killer for hydrogen fuel cell cars is their wind-to-wheel or solar-to-wheel inefficiency. Driving a small family car 100 kilometres, whether hydrogen fuel cell or battery electric, uses around 15 kilowatt hours of motive energy at the wheels. For the battery electric vehicle, you have to take into account losses on the grid, in the battery charge and discharge cycle, and in the drivetrain, so that translates into a need for 25 kilowatt hours at the plant where the electricity is generated. The equivalent for the hydrogen fuel cell car, given losses in electrolysis, in compression, in transport, in storage, and in reconversion of the hydrogen, is around 75 kilowatt hours, 3 times as high. While more R&D could perhaps narrow the gap somewhat, basic physics says it will never be close to be eliminated. And of course, R&D continues to improve batteries too. There is good reason why Elon Musk calls them fool cells. Undeterred by all this, the Hydrogen Council, the fast-growing association of the largest industrial names promoting hydrogen, still sees 1 in 12 cars sold in California, Germany, Japan, and South Korea by 2030 powered by hydrogen. That's cumulative sales of 13 million and 10,000 filling stations. In their dreams. It's not just cars either. The underlying physics and economics are no different when it comes to any form of urban and peri-urban transport. Buses, delivery vans, commercial vehicles, 2- and 3-wheelers, service and industrial vehicles. In fact, pretty much anything that does not regularly drive over 300 miles without stopping is better as a battery electric vehicle than as a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. Weight makes no difference. The fundamental energy economics of an 18-wheeler undertaking 150 miles per day of drayage are the same as for a delivery van or a private car driving the same distance. You just need a bigger battery and a higher powered charger. Forklift trucks, which may operate 24/7 in an enclosed space, are often cited as a counterexample, but the fact is hydrogen forklift trucks have a global market share of around 2%, achieved in competition with lead-acid batteries, not lithium-ion. It is not obvious at all that even in that niche, hydrogen will come close to winning. As for those who want to use hydrogen to make a drop-in synthetic fuel or e-fuel, perhaps dimethyl ether, DME, or methanol, their economics are even worse. You're adding production stages and, because they all require a source of zero-emissions carbon, much more cost. The wind-to-wheel or solar-to-wheel efficiency of e-fuels is even worse than that of hydrogen, perhaps requiring 6 times as much renewable generating capacity to be built for each car as a battery electric vehicle. It's a non-starter. Surely, I hear some of you cry, when it comes to longer distances and heavy freight, hydrogen must finally come into its own. South Korea's Hyundai has delivered its first 10 fuel cell trucks for testing by commercial fleet customers in Switzerland. Kenworth has been testing a fuel cell truck since 2017. Toyota and Hino are collaborating on a fuel cell truck, as are Daimler and Volvo. Hydrogen fuel cell trucks must work. Otherwise, how did Nikola Motor raise so much money, right? Not necessarily, says Auke Hoekstra, a researcher at Eindhoven Technical University. First, he found that 90% of 40-ton trucks entering and leaving the port of Rotterdam drive less than 750 kilometers per day. After optimizing the truck's drag, that means a 1 megawatt-hour battery weighing 6 tons based on today's technology, but on track to decrease to 3 or 4 tons within the decade. What he also found was that replacing the internal combustion drivetrain with electric motors would save up to 3 tons, meaning that in terms of payload between battery electric trucks and traditional trucks, it's almost a wash. As for fueling, as long as trucks have drivers, they need to stop for breaks, 45 minutes per 4.5 hours in the EU. And VW's CEO, Herbert Diess, agrees with Auke Hoekstra. After trying to sell both battery and hydrogen versions, VW's Scania truck unit has given up on hydrogen and gone all in on battery electric trucks. If you're worried about big rigs spending too long at charging stations, David Seaborn, a professor of mechanical engineering at Cambridge University, estimates that a catenary overhead charging network for the UK's major road system could be delivered at a cost of just £19 billion. That's $25 billion. That's likely to be far cheaper than switching the UK's commercial fleet to more expensive and complex fuel cell vehicles, investing in hydrogen production, and providing the associated fueling infrastructure. For intercontinental road systems, you could easily have intermittent sections offering catenary charging, perfect for platooning when we eventually have self-driving trucks. As it goes for trucks, so it goes for long-distance coaches as well as for trains. It's great fun to read about Alstom's hydrogen I-Lint train running a 62-mile route in northern Germany since 2018, or the Hydroflex train, which is currently on trials in the UK. But as so often where hydrogen is involved, you have to ask not whether it works, but what problem does it solve? A hydrogen train eliminates the need to electrify the track, but at the cost of locking in forever an option that is more complex, higher maintenance, and less than half the efficiency. Trains carrying batteries to get them between electrified stretches of track, as developed by Bombardier and Alstom, as well as UK startup Viva Rail, feel like a cheaper and much more elegant solution. Let's recap. For land transportation, anything urban or peri-urban sits right at the bottom of the hydrogen ladder, a horrible use of public or private money. While long-distance freight might offer a reprieve for hydrogen, it's by no means obvious, putting it just a rung or two higher. Before we give up on land vehicles entirely, however, there is one segment where hydrogen really looks more promising, and that's off-road vehicles. If you're working in a forest, on a construction site, or at a mine where there's no grid connection, it's between hydrogen, synthetic fuel, and biofuels, and hydrogen just might have the edge. When it comes to aviation and shipping, the prospects look much more promising. We're seeing a rush of electrified ferries around the world, as predicted in my 2018 piece Planes, Trains and Automobiles, the Electric Remake. But the poor energy density of batteries today makes it difficult for them to serve routes over 40 nautical miles, 75 kilometres. A breakthrough in battery chemistry, such as solid-state batteries, might allow the 150 nautical mile or 280 kilometre barrier to be breached electrically in coming decades. But for longer routes, and certainly for ocean-going vessels, zero-carbon shipping means carrying zero-carbon fuel. Biofuels might meet some of the demand, as might biogas if it's not all snapped up for heating. Far more likely, however, will be either hydrogen or a derivative molecule like methanol or ammonia. The latter, according to the International Energy Agency and many others, looks like the leading contender. That's if we don't take a leaf out of military ships and switch the very largest tankers and container ships to nuclear. Look, someone has to say the unpopular things. Then there's aviation. Prior to COVID-19, flying consumed around 8 million barrels of jet fuel per day. Biojet is certainly one net zero option, but global biofuels production is stalled around 2 million barrels per day. Since it seems certain that demand for air travel will bounce back after the pandemic and keep growing thereafter, a breakthrough is needed. Electrification looks highly promising for general aviation and short haul, up to, say, around 500 miles. Maybe that will push out to 1,000 miles over the coming couple of decades, with solid-state battery or other new technologies. Beyond that, however, even though the propulsion system may well end up being electric with hybrid architectures, the fuel of choice will have to be either hydrogen, ammonia, or a synthetic liquid fuel made by combining green hydrogen with carbon either captured from the air or produced via biomass. Airbus recently revealed a range of hydrogen-powered concepts. I've deliberately left the question of hydrogen's role in the power system until last. Until you get a sense of how competition between hydrogen and electricity is going to play out in the rest of the economy, it's hard to speculate about the architecture of a future net zero emissions power system. So far, we've seen that zero carbon hydrogen will become the mainstay of the chemicals industry. It will replace grey hydrogen, force out fossil-based chemical feedstocks, and form either the fuel or the building blocks for fuels in aviation and shipping. But its direct use on the demand side of the economy will be otherwise fairly limited. What will not be limited in its use, by contrast, is electricity. Electricity currently amounts to only around 20% of global final energy. As we move towards net zero, we are likely to see this proportion increase to 60 or 80% by 2050. It is this all-encompassing use of electricity that's going to provide green hydrogen with its most substantial opportunity, making sure that the lights stay on in absolutely all circumstances. As we saw in part 1 of this mini-series on hydrogen, it's perfectly possible to envisage a power system reaching 80% capacity factor based on reasonably priced renewables plus interconnections, demand response and batteries. You might even get to 90%. The remaining 10 to 20%, however, will be much tougher to deliver. In particular, you have to cover long renewable resource lulls, rainy periods and monsoons in the Sunbelt, windless weeks further north and south, and sudden demand surges, the beast from the east, cold snap, which occasionally hits the UK and other northern European countries, polar vortices in the US, heat waves like the recent Canadian heat dome, which drive up air conditioning use for weeks, and the like. There are, of course, a number of technologies that can provide energy even during these periods, which we can put in a cost-merit order. The cheapest will be demand response. Ask energy-intensive users to turn down demand temporarily. Batteries will be good for a few hours, maybe a few days, but not more. We can do a bit more with pumped storage and biomass or biogas. Then there's overcapacity. Simply build enough generation fleet to meet peak demand at the worst time of the year, as grid designers have done since time immemorial, and then shed excess power. We've already seen from part 1 that this excess might be used to make hydrogen, but will not on its own justify investing in extra electrolysis capacity. High voltage DC will find its place in smoothing out long duration mismatches between supply and demand. Sun Cable and X-Links, designed to bring dispatchable solar power from Australia to Singapore and North Africa to the UK respectively, sound outlandish today, but remember that the concept of a motorway sounded outlandish in 1920. Of course, you could build nuclear or geothermal plants, but running them only as intermittent backup destroys whatever hope they might have had of being economically viable. So that brings us to hydrogen. Both zero-carbon hydrogen, or its derivative ammonia, and natural gas with CCS could provide unlimited amounts of flexible power. Let's look at the second of these first. Conventional gas generation with CCS will make no economic sense at all. As more cheap variable renewable capacity is built, gas will be increasingly used as backup. The capital cost of fitting it with CCS, only to run it at a low capacity factor, will be prohibitive. Split the process into two, however, and the capital-intensive stage, separating out and re-injecting CO2, can be run at a very high capacity factor, leaving the second stage, using the hydrogen, to be intermittent. What I am describing is, of course, our old friend from part 1, blue hydrogen. The extra value of zero-emissions hydrogen, be it green, blue, turquoise or whatever, over and above all other flexible power options, is that it can be stored in unlimited quantities. Hydrogen is therefore the only solution that can provide what I call deep resilience to the highly electrified net zero economy of the future. To play this role, it will need to be available in bulk, stored in salt caverns, in pressure vessels, as a liquid in insulated tanks, and or as ammonia. It will need to be moved around cheaply via pipelines or at a higher cost by ship, train or truck. And it will need to be strategically positioned to cover the risk of supply shocks, whether they result from normal weather patterns, extreme weather events and natural disasters, conflict, terrorism, cyber attacks, or any other cause. Will the resulting energy system be prohibitively expensive? Let's assume that 80 to 90% of power is super cheap wind and solar at $20 per megawatt hour or less. Perhaps it's $30 per megawatt hour once you've added some storage and interconnections. Even if the remaining 10 to 20% of flexible power delivered from net zero hydrogen and providing 100% network uptime costs a whopping $150 per megawatt hour, that still only gives a blended wholesale power price of around $50 per megawatt hour. That's not so far from where most industrialized countries are today. Not bad for a high-performing, zero-carbon and deeply resilient electrical system. This, therefore, is what the future looks like. This is the energy system politicians need to explain, policymakers need to design, regulators need to usher into life, and business and innovators need to deliver. I want to leave you with one final thought. As you look at the role of clean hydrogen in this future net zero energy system, you should notice something striking. None of the compelling use cases for hydrogen, the ones high up on my hydrogen ladder, are widely distributed. No massive demand for hydrogen filling stations or hydrogen boilers, no hydrogen-based heat in most industries. Those are all low down on the ladder. Instead, the overwhelming bulk of hydrogen use in the future will be, as it is today, in the chemicals industry. And then additional demand will come from the power system, but generated centrally. What this means is that hydrogen will not be about homes and small communities trying to get off-grid, so-called hydrogen homesteads. It will be about industrial hydrogen hubs. These will be areas where heavy industry, chemicals, fertilizer, refineries and steel come together with shipping, freight transport, pipeline and power infrastructure. Hydrogen hubs are also where we will see providers of what I call CCS as a service plying their trade, dealing with process emissions from the cement and other industries, and perhaps from the production of blue hydrogen. And maybe, depending on their cost and ability to manage risk, small modular nuclear plants, perhaps paired up with electrolysis or other industrial processes that can be turned down in the event of a power supply crunch to deliver yet more flexibility to the system. There are plenty of big plans in the pipeline: HyNet and H2H Saltend in the UK, H-Vision Rotterdam and North H2 in the Netherlands, H2 Cluster Norway, Fukushima in Japan, Ulsan in South Korea, Les Eaux de France, San Pedro Bay ports in California, Pilbara in Western Australia, Hebei, Hunan and Shandong in China, and many others. So you want a hydrogen economy? Forget your local petrol station. Forget your boiler room, your whiskey distillery, your food processing plant. It's in heavy industrial clusters like these that you're likely to find it. And that brings to an end this two-part mini-series, separating hype from hydrogen, based on my BloombergNEF blogs of the same name. I hope it's helped you to figure out the role that hydrogen will and won't play in the future net zero economy. And with that, I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of the summer. I'll be back at the beginning of September with a new series of cleaning up. I've already started recording it, and I know you're not going to be disappointed. Stay safe and well, and have a great break.